The biggest mistake, the untold reason the Titanic sank. You think you know the story. A giant ship, a dark night, a massive iceberg, a tragic but simple accident. The ultimate cautionary tale about the arrogance of man versus the power of nature. We've all seen the movie. We all know how it ends. But what if I told you the iceberg was just the final nail in the coffin? What if the Titanic was already a dead ship walking before it even left the dock? What if the real killer wasn't floating in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, but burning deep inside the ship itself? A mistake so mundane, so common, that the people in charge desperately tried to hide it for weeks. This is the story of the Titanic coal fire, the secret, smoldering disaster that turned the unsinkable ship into a floating time bomb. A mistake that proves the biggest disasters in history are never caused by one thing, but by a cascade of corporate arrogance, terrible decisions, and systemic failures. Welcome to the story of the biggest mistake, the fire that raged for weeks before departure, the decision to sail anyway and accelerate through ice fields, and the final, fatal collision that was not just an accident, it was the inevitable conclusion of choices made by people who thought they were too big to fail. Let's get into it to understand what really happened to the Titanic. You have to understand the coal. The Titanic wasn't some magical floating palace powered by dreams and first-class champagne. It was a coal-burning behemoth, a monster that consumed coal like a dragon consumes villages. 300 men worked in brutal shifts around the clock in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, shoveling hundreds of tons of coal into 29 massive boilers just to keep the engines running. The coal was stored in massive bunkers deep in the ship's belly. Dark, dusty caverns filled with tons upon tons of compressed fuel. And here's something they don't tell you in the tourist brochures. Coal, when left undisturbed in tight, poorly ventilated spaces, can spontaneous limpness. Not from a spark, not from someone dropping a cigarette, just from heat, pressure, and chemical reactions doing what they naturally do. The coal generates heat as it oxidizes, and when you pile tons of it together, that heat has nowhere to go. It builds, it intensifies, and eventually, it ignites. This was a well-known problem on coal-powered ships of the era. It happened all the time, almost routine. Ships would deal with small coal fires regularly. But the Titanic's fire? That was different. Days before the Titanic left Southampton on April 10, 1912, a fire was discovered, and this wasn't a small flame you could douse with a bucket of water. This was a serious, raging inferno burning at temperatures well over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The kind of fire that is certainly impossible to put out with water, because the water just turns to steam instantly and spreads the heat even further. You can't smother it. You can't flood it. The only way to deal with it is to remove the burning coal completely. So what did the White Star Line do when they discovered this massive fire? In the heart of their flagship vessel, just days before the most publicized maiden voyage in history? Here's where the biggest mistake begins, the corporate cover-up. The White Star Line knew about the fire. The officers knew. The captain knew. The executive knew. And they all agreed on one thing: keep it quiet. Keep it secret. Why? Because announcing a massive, uncontrollable fire on the unsinkable ship right before its maiden voyage is catastrophically bad for business. Think about it. They'd spent years building this ship, millions of pounds. The marketing campaign called it unsinkable. Tickets were sold to the wealthiest people in the world. The press was watching. The world was watching. Admitting there was a fire that they couldn't control? That would destroy everything. So what was their solution? Not to delay the voyage and properly extinguish the fire. Not to bring in experts to assess the damage. Not to prioritize the safety of the 2,200 souls who would board that ship. The solution was to feed the fire to the engines, burn through the burning coal first, consummate. Get rid of the evidence by turning it into steam and propulsion. On paper, it sounds almost reasonable. But this decision created a terrifying domino effect that would seal the fate of everyone on board. First, it meant the ship had to sail at full speed to consume the burning coal before the fire spread to other bunkers. This is why the Titanic was racing through the North Atlantic ice field at nearly 23 knots, despite receiving multiple ice warnings from other ships. Not for glory, not for a speed record, not to arrive in New York early and impress the press. The Titanic was running from the fire, consuming it from within seconds. And this is the truly sinister part. Bunker number 6 was located right next to a critical bulkhead in the hull. That's the steel wall separating different watertight compartments. The very design feature that was supposed to make the ship unsinkable. The ship could survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, because these bulkheads would contain the water for days, possibly even weeks if the fire started during loading. That steel wall was subjected to sustained temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The metal wasn't just warm. It was glowing red hot from the inside. It was being fundamentally altered at a molecular level. And nobody warned the passengers. Nobody sounded an alarm. The fire was just another problem to be managed quietly, efficiently, out of sight. Now let's talk about what that fire was actually doing to the ship. Because this is where engineering hubris meets cold, hard physics. The biggest mistake here is blind faith in materials. The Titanic's hull was made of steel. High-quality steel, too. The best materials money could buy in 1912. Steel is strong. Steel is reliable. Steel is what made ships like the Titanic possible. Steel is what made the marketing department confident enough to call it unsinkable. Except here's what they don't tell you in the engineering textbooks of that era. Or maybe they did and nobody bothered to read them. Steel, when subjected to extreme heat for extended periods, loses up to 75% of its structural strength. Let me say that again. So it really sinks in. 75%. When steel is heated to temperatures above 600 degrees Celsius, its molecular structure begins to change. The bonds weaken. The material becomes brittle. It loses its ability to flex and absorb impact. And at 1,000 degrees, you might as well be dealing with reinforced aluminum foil. So the area of the hull that was weakened by weeks of fire damage was precisely, almost poetically, the exact area that would later be struck by the iceberg. The iceberg didn't just hit a solid steel wall designed to withstand massive impacts. It hit a steel wall that had been baked, weakened, and compromised for weak steel that had lost most of its structural integrity. Steel that was brittle and vulnerable. When the iceberg made contact with the Titanic's starboard side on April 14th at 11:40 p.m., it didn't have to work very hard. The weakened steel tore like paper. The damage spread across multiple compartments far more easily than it should have. And here's where the cover-up gets even more insidious. The official inquiries, both the American inquiry led by Senator William Alden Smith and the British inquiry led by Lord Mersey, focused on everything else. They examined the rivets in excruciating detail. They questioned the number of lifeboats. They analyzed the ship's speed. They interrogated the lookouts who didn't spot the iceberg in time. They debated whether the ship should have turned differently or maintained course. But the fire that had been burning for weeks, the fire that had fundamentally weakened the hull in the exact location of the fatal breach, it was mentioned briefly, dismissed as a minor incident that had been dealt with appropriately. The crew. Nothing to see here. Move along. Because to admit the fire was a critical contributing factor was to admit corporate negligence. On a massive scale, it was to admit that the White Star Line knowingly sent a compromised, damaged vessel into dangerous waters with over 2,000 people on board. It was to admit catastrophic failure of judgment, priority, and ethics at the highest levels of the company. Think about the tragic irony of it all. The ship was racing across the Atlantic, pushing through known ice fields at full speed, trying to outrun and consume the evidence of the fire. And in doing so, it ran headlong into the one thing that would expose the fire's damage in the most catastrophic way possible. If the hull had been at full strength, if those steel plates had their complete structural integrity, the iceberg might have caused a serious breach in one compartment, maybe two at most. The Titanic was specifically, carefully designed to survive flooding in 4 compartments. That was the whole point. That's what made it unsinkable. The watertight bulkheads would contain damage. The pumps would manage the flooding, and the ship would limp to port for repairs. But the weakened, fire-damaged steel allowed the breach to spread across 6 compartments. The math was brutally simple. 4 compartments flooded, Ship survives. 6 compartments fluid. Ship goes down. There's no middle ground. No room for error. The physics are unforgiving. The biggest mistake is always the accumulation of small errors. The spontaneous coal fire was unfortunate, but not unusual. The decision to sail anyway was questionable but understandable from a business perspective. The choice to accelerate through ice fields was reckless, but not unprecedented. The arrogance of calling it unsinkable was hubris, but common in that era, individually. Maybe the ship survives any one of these factors. But together they created the perfect storm of disaster. The ship sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. By 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic had completely disappeared beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. Over 1,500 people died in the freezing water. Families torn apart. Fortunes lost. An entire generation of wealth, talent, and potential erased in a single night. The world mourned. Newspapers ran endless coverage. The tragedy dominated global conversation for months. It was the defining disaster of the early 20th century. And then came the official narrative. Carefully crafted, meticulously controlled, designed to protect reputations and limit liability. Simple, clean, nobody's fault, really. Just the overwhelming power of nature defeating the best efforts of mankind. The fire? That inconvenient, complicated truth? It was swept under the rug so thoroughly that most people today have never even heard about it. The official inquiries, both in America and Britain, were conducted with remarkable speed. Too much speed, some might say. The White Star Line had powerful friends. The shipbuilders, Harlan and Wolff, had political connections. Insurance companies wanted clear answers that wouldn't complicate payouts. Everyone involved had enormous financial incentives to reach a quick, simple conclusion. They needed a villain, a clear, unambiguous cause, something the public could understand and accept. The iceberg was perfect. It was natural. It was blameless. It couldn't hire lawyers. It couldn't file countersuits. It couldn't testify about what it knew or didn't know. It just sat there in the water, being an iceberg, taking all the blame. But here's the thing that should make your blood boil. The fire theory wasn't some wild conspiracy cooked up by internet theorists decades later. It was a documented fact known to dozens of crew members. Passengers boarding in Southampton noticed unusual scorch marks on the hull. Some even commented on it, asking crew members what had happened. They were told it was nothing, just cosmetic damage from construction. A coal stoker named John Dilly gave detailed testimony about fighting the fire for days. He described the hellish conditions in Bunker 6, the unbearable heat, the frantic efforts to shovel burning coal into the furnaces as fast as possible. The fear that the fire would spread. Other crew members corroborated the story. The fire was real. It was serious. It was unresolved when the ship sailed. But this testimony was inconvenient. It complicated the narrative. It pointed toward culpable negligence at the highest levels of the company. So in the final official reports, it was quietly minimized, reduced to a footnote, stripped of context and consequence. The biggest mistake, the one that keeps repeating throughout history, is the prioritization of profit over safety, reputation over reality, expediency over ethics. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a statement, a symbol of human achievement and technological progress. It was a race to prove that Britain still ruled the waves, that man could conquer nature, that engineering could overcome any obstacle, that nothing was impossible in this brave new century. The fire was just an inconvenient complication, a problem to be managed through PR and procedures, not a fundamental warning about the dangers of hubris and the limits of control. And the result? Over 1,500 lives lost, hundreds of families destroyed, an entire generation scarred by the realization that progress and technology couldn't actually protect them from the consequences of human error and corporate greed. The real lesson of the Titanic isn't about icebergs or lifeboats, though those matter too. The real lesson is that arrogance is the most corrosive force in engineering and society. It weakens the steel of our infrastructure. It blinds the leaders making critical decisions. It silences voices trying to tell the truth. It creates the conditions where disaster becomes inevitable. And here's the most disturbing part. We keep making the same mistake over and over again every time a company cuts corners to meet a deadline. We're loading coal into Bunker 6. Every time a safety warning is dismissed as overdramatic or bad for business. We're ignoring fire every time someone prioritizes reputation over transparency, profit over people, speed over safety. We are sailing the Titanic again, so what's the moral of the most famous maritime disaster in history? What can we actually learn from this tragedy that happened over a century ago? It's this: the biggest mistakes are never really about the immediate, visible failure. They're always systemic. They're built into the culture, the incentives, the structure of how organizations make decisions and prioritize values. The fire wasn't the disease. It was just the first symptom of a disease called hubris. The belief that you're too smart, too advanced, too well-funded to fail. The conviction that the normal rules didn't apply to you because you're special, because you're innovative, because you're disrupting the industry. Sound familiar? It should, because we see this pattern play out again and again in modern times. Chernobyl happened because operators ignored safety protocols and pushed an unstable reactor to its limits, convinced they had everything under control. The Challenger explosion happened because engineers warned about O-ring failures in cold weather, but managers overruled them to keep the launch schedule on track. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes happened because automated systems were added with it proper pilot training, and warning signs were dismissed until to plane loads of people did. Every single one follows the same script: a known problem, a decision to proceed anyway, and then a desperate scramble to control the narrative after people die. The real tragedy of the Titanic isn't that it sank. Ships sink. Accidents happen. We understand that. The real tragedy is that it was allowed to sail in the first place. That warnings were ignored, that corners were cut, that the people in charge believed their own propaganda about being unsinkable so completely, that they gambled with thousands of lives. And here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to hear. We're still making the exact same mistakes today. We've just gotten better at hiding them and managing the PR afterwards. The power to break this cycle doesn't lie in developing better technology or using stronger materials, though those help. It lies in fundamentally changing how we make decisions, in demanding transparency of errors, in questioning the unsinkable claims every time we hear them, in refusing to accept "trust us, we're experts" as a sufficient answer when lives are at stake. It lies in remembering that the most dangerous phrase in any organization is, "It's fine. We'll deal with it later." Because later always comes. Physics doesn't care about your marketing campaign. Reality doesn't negotiate. The steel is either strong enough or it isn't. The fire is either controlled or it isn't. And by the time you realize you made the wrong choice, people are already drowning in freezing water. The next time you hear a company promise perfection, the next time a leader assures you that everything is under control, the next time someone tells you not to worry about that warning light because they've got it handled. Remember the Titanic. Remember the fire that raged in the darkness while executives whispered about protecting the brand and maintaining the schedule. Remember that the biggest mistakes in history are always the ones they tried to hide, because the Titanic didn't sink because of an iceberg. Not really. It sank because people in positions of power and responsibility chose to ignore a fire. They chose profit over safety, speed over prudence, reputation over reality, and that choice, that fundamental prioritization of image over substance, of quarterly results over long-term consequences, of appearing invincible over admitting vulnerability, that's the mistake that still haunts us today. The power to fix it is in demanding a world that is built for safety, not for speed, for transparency, not for spin, for reality, not for reassurance. That's how we stop selling the Titanic over and over again. Thanks for watching. If this changed the way you think about the Titanic, or about how we repeat same mistakes throughout history, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about the disasters we could have prevented. If someone had just been brave enough to tell the truth, and tell me in the comments, what's the biggest mistake happening right now that you think is being covered up? What's the modern fire burning in the hull that everyone's pretending doesn't exist? See you in the next one.